this is the last topic that we're going to cover today, and this is a very important topic because I remember I gave a talk, it's about probably 10 years ago, and we started talking about water and energy, and I made a prediction that in the very near future, we are going to see countries going to war to fight for the water, okay? And I hope we don't see it, but you know what? If you look at what's happening around the world, very soon you're going to see armies really going to the border, trying to fight for a river, or a lake, or a glacier, because water is becoming a major issue. Now, does it mean that we are running out of water on the planet? Of course not. I mean, there's a lot of water. I mean, look at the oceans. I mean, 3/4 of the surface of the earth is covered with water. The problem is that we have a lot of water in some places where we don't need it. And then there are places where we need water and there's really no clean water. And Spain has gone through major droughts in the last few years. Australia, I don't know if you read the news in the last 5 years, Australia has been facing major droughts. California in the US, I mean, there are emergency measures in California where you have to implement some water saving measures. You can no longer irrigate your yard. People are changing from grass to cactus and other desert kind of plants. People are putting artificial grass in their homes because it's becoming very expensive and not impossible to irrigate the water. So this is actually pretty serious. And the problem is that in places like California, California supplies a lot of food, not just to the US, but to many places in the world. So, and that's a very water-intensive operation. So these are examples in not just water in general, but also the connection between water and energy. And you know, this is not a problem that started yesterday. This has been going on for almost 10 years in California. And California is the most populated state in the US. And again, if you haven't read the news, I mean, this is really a crisis type of scenario in California. Obviously, you know, this is 2008, and they knew that this was only the beginning, and that water shortages could really affect the ability of the state to prosper economically. Spain, you know, same thing, this 2008. Water is a new battleground. So major changes, and obviously these things are connected to global changes in weather patterns. And again, it's not that water is disappearing from the planet. I mean, there's a lot of water. The problem is that water is actually moving in areas where we don't want it to go. And the same, you know, the same time that we are having water shortages and droughts in some areas, we have floodings and a lot of water in some other places. And this is going to be the challenge for the next few years. Australia was in such a difficult situation that they have already started doing some business with Japan to start moving big chunks of ice from the Antarctic into Australia to supply fresh water. What happened at the end is that in Australia they started building some desalination plants to use water from the ocean. So again, the problem is that we don't have water. We have a lot of water. The problem is that water from the ocean has salt, and you have to desalinate, and obviously that's going to require a lot of energy. And here is where the water energy nexus happens, that you need a lot of energy to purify water, and that, as I'm going to show you, need a lot of water to generate electricity. And this is the real challenge. So again, serious issues here when you have people really facing significant challenges lack of water. And then the other problem, like we have in California, do you use water for human consumption, or do you use water to support agriculture? And there is a governor in California, his name is Jerry Brown. He's a very progressive, very liberal guy, very smart guy. And he was criticized in his decisions. He said, we're going to have to impose some restrictions on water utilization in the cities. And he didn't want to impose any restrictions on agricultural use of water. And somebody said, hey, wait a minute, I mean, you are growing almonds in California, and almond is a plant that requires a lot of water. I said, why are we doing that? And he, this is where you guys start realizing the challenge. He said, if we stop growing almonds, we have 500,000 people who depend on agriculture. What are we going to do with those 500,000 workers if we decide to stop growing almonds? And here is where the consequences of all these policies that we talked about this morning are going to come into the picture. Somebody's going to have to pay for something. That's the second law of thermodynamics. You cannot get anything for free. Okay? So do we pay for CO2 carbon capture and sequestration now? Or do we pay 10 years from today having 1 million people without work, having to feed them? Or do we have to move 1 million people from Bangladesh because the levels of the ocean raise a meter, and then all of a sudden you have people homeless that need to be relocated? Not just in Bangladesh, the same thing could be said about Florida or New York or the East Coast in the US. So these are the real choices that we're going to have to start making. And this is an example where this was a very interesting question here. Where do we put restrictions? Agriculture, human consumption, industrial use. What happens if we have a nuclear reactor that requires water? You need a lot of water to produce electricity. Do you stop the flow of water to a nuclear reactor? What happens when the temperature of the water increases by 5 degrees and you no longer cool down the reactor? In fact, we had to shut down reactors in the US in the last 3 years because the surface temperature of the lakes where they were located increased so much and you could no longer cool down the reactors. So you have excess heat, you shut down your reactors, you don't have electricity, which means that you don't have air conditioning, which means that you don't have electricity for the plants, so you have the economy going down. Think about all these consequences. And this is why I want to talk to you about the issues of public policy this morning. Because all these things have consequences, okay? And these are very serious consequences. In fact, these are examples in Nevada where they were installing some concentrated solar power plants that require water to move a turbine. And those projects had to be stopped because of lack of water. Okay? And obviously this is not new. There are probably 1,000 investigators in the world looking into this. There's a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, Michael Weber. He's one of the leading authorities. And he has written a number of books. And he goes into a lot of detail in the connections between water and energy. So I encourage you to review this information. Again, this is not new. People have done a very thorough analysis. And the realization is that there is a very strong connection between energy and water. So where is that connection coming from? Well, every time you have a power plant, whether it's a fossil fuel power plant or even a nuclear reactor, you need water. Number one, to move the turbines, produce steam to move the turbines, and number two, to cool down the steam after it has run through the turbine. And a lot of times you use cooling towers, and that obviously is going to require water. A lot of times this water goes up into the atmosphere and it may be moved to a long distance. But without water, you cannot generate electricity the way we are doing it today. Okay? There's just no question about that. So just to put things in perspective, how much water do we need to generate electricity? So to generate 1 megawatt hour of electricity requires between 7,000 and 20,000 gallons of water if you use a gas steam combined cycle. So if you remember, we had a slide showing these combined cycle plants. You have a gas turbine on the top, you have a steam turbine on the bottom, okay? And to use to generate 1 megawatt hour using that system requires between 7,000 and 20,000 gallons of water. Without water, you cannot generate electricity using these power plants. If you have a coal or an oil power plant, it's between 20 and 50,000 gallons of water to get a megawatt hour of electricity. If you have a nuclear reactor, you need between 20 and 60,000 gallons of water. Okay? Now I told you that I'm a true believer in nuclear power, and we're going to really need nuclear power to displace fossil fuels. But you cannot have a nuclear power plant far away from a water source, and it's going to require a lot of water to produce electricity. Okay? So this is a big challenge. Now, if you're in California and you have to provide clean water to the citizens of the state, how much energy do you need to provide clean water? So if you are taking water from a lake or a river, you need 1,400 kilowatt hours to get 1 million gallons of clean water, okay? And the energy here is going to come from pumps. You got to pump water from the lake or the river to the city. To get 1 million gallons of clean water, you need 1,400 kilowatt hours of energy. If you're going to get water from a well underground, you need pumps. So you're going to need 1,800. You will have a waste water treatment plant that requires probably twice as much energy. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of water. I mean, we have the oceans. There's 30% of the surface of the air is water, but the amount of energy needed to purify that water is really astronomical. So it's not the problem that we don't have water. The problem is that we don't have fresh water. We have a lot of seawater, and that's going to require a lot of energy to make fresh water. Okay? So what type of technologies can we use to purify water? What's the most common one? Desalination. What can we do? If we boil water, you boil water, get steam, salt precipitates, and then you condense water. Well, if you're going to boil water, you need energy to boil water. Okay, so that's one part. What's another technology to desalinate water? Membranes, by osmotic pressure. We have a process called osmosis, where you could have a membrane and you could have pressure. So you can pressure water through a membrane, and then you make the membrane where the orifices in the membrane are just big enough to let the water go through, but to capture salt. Okay? But that requires energy. I mean, if you want to push water with a pump, you got to pressurize water to go through the membrane. That requires energy. Probably the newest technology, and I'm going to show you that later this week, is to use graphene. Jose Antonio told me that last week or a few weeks ago he had some speakers on graphene. Were you guys here? Remember? So the idea with graphene is that you have these regular arrangements of carbon atoms. But if you could break some bonds, you could make bigger pores in the graphene structure. Okay? And if you could make them just big enough to capture salt, you should be able to purify water using graphene. Okay? Now that requires some knowledge, but the nice thing about this is that the amount of pressure that you need to purify water with graphene is less than what you require with some of the conventional membranes. So here is a case where material science, again, could come into the rescue. Developing membranes that require low pressure to purify water, especially water from the ocean. There's a lot of water in the ocean. The problem is that it's going to require energy to purify that water. Okay. So the same way we have a energy flow diagram, people have built these water flow diagrams, and this is a snapshot of 2005 in the US. And this gives you an idea of the amount of water that are used per day in the US. This is 410 million gallons of water per day. So where's the water coming from in the US? Well, most of the water is surface water. These are lakes and rivers. The bulk of the water in the US comes from lakes and rivers. If you follow the water, it tells you how it's used. If you see the bulk goes either to irrigation for agriculture or to produce electricity. Okay? That's where the bulk of water is utilized. Obviously, you have mining. People use water for mining, commercial and industrial processes. This is the water that you use to shower or to drink at home, domestic use. Sometimes you have desalination plants. This is water from the ocean, and most of these goes to produce electricity. If you have wells underwater, you can use most of this water for irrigation processes. And this is in the rural areas of the U.S. where you have a well, you drill, get water, and use it for irrigation. And then you have also near the ocean, you have groundwater that is contains salt, and most of that is used for public supply. So this is what California is starting to do now. They are building a couple of plants near San Diego. These are desalination plants that want to use water from the ocean to supply for human consumption. This is the diagram for just California. So this was for the whole USA. This is just for California, and it pretty much reflects, it's very similar to the US, except that what I was telling you here, the bulk of the water in California is used for irrigation. Agriculture is one of the biggest industries in California. So the decision of not putting any restrictions here versus putting restrictions in domestic and commercial use was a very controversial one. But the governor, to his credit, you have 500,000 people depending on agriculture. So what happens if you stop supplying water to the agricultural industry in California? You have 500,000 people and their families becoming unemployed. I mean, just think about the implications of that. And obviously, Spain went through a major crisis in the last few years. So I know you guys appreciate the fact that what happens when people lose their jobs. And, so it's the type of scenarios that we're going to have to address in the near future. So what do I want you to remember? Well, water and energy are interrelated. Okay, there's just no question about it. You need water to generate electricity. You need energy to purify water. So this is the so-called water-energy nexus. These things are interrelated. This relationship is already under strain. And what has happened in California should be a wake-up call to the rest of the planet. Okay? What's happening in California is going to start replicating in other places. Australia just went through a major situation similar to what California has been going through. And this is going to get worse. It's going to get worse because of population growth. As I told you, economic growth is connected to energy utilization. And we need water to generate electricity, so these things are connected. Obviously, with climate change patterns changing, it's going to put more strain into the system. And then, who decides who uses water? I mean, it's going to be down to politicians, and sometimes the decisions are difficult decisions, but somebody is going to get the short end of the street. And then lastly, we go back to public policies. We can do the best science that we can come up with the best graphene, the best membranes, thermoelectric materials, but at the end of the day, it's going to be public policy what's really going to dictate which direction we're going to be moving. So let's conclude today's session, and let me share with you some general ideas. The first one is that there is a lot of energy on the planet. Sometimes I remember we used to talk about energy. Somebody said, "Oh, we are running out of energy. We are running out of energy." No. There is a lot of energy on the planet. Okay, plenty of energy. The problem is that not all sources of energy are the same. We talk about fossil fuels. There's a lot of coal in the planet. There's a lot of oil still. We have lots of natural gas. We have uranium. We have the sun. The problem is that not all sources of energy are equal, and we have seen that the emissions associated with fossil fuels are a major problem. So there's a lot of coal. Believe me, the U.S. has coal for the next 300 years, but that's the wrong type of energy. So the message is that we are not running out of energy. Okay, we have a lot of energy. The problem is that not all sources of energy are the same. The second thing I want you to remember is China, India, Brazil, Indonesia. This is where the biggest challenges are going to happen. Every one of those people want to live like you live in the West, like people live in the US. Everybody wants to drive a car. Everybody wants air conditioning. Everyone has to have a microwave oven, plasma TV, computer. Everybody wants to travel by airplane. And the problem is that all of that means a lot of energy. And as long as we use the wrong source of energy, that's going to cause significant challenges. So people tell us in the US, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. You are telling China not to use coal, but you US used coal for 200 years, and you are the power that you are because coal was cheap and you use it. And that's the truth. That's really the truth. We don't have a moral authority to tell the rest of the world what can be done. but I think we have a responsibility to work with the rest of the world to come together to address some of these big challenges. And I'm glad that President Obama, for example, has started working with China and with India and bringing the world community together to address global emissions in the planet. As I told you, you guys can be the best scientists, you guys can be the best engineers, but we also have to take into consideration public policies. Public policies are an important aspect of what gets done and how it gets done. And I encourage you to be active. You know, one day you guys are going to be influential, and policymakers are going to come to you as engineers and they're going to ask for your opinion. It's going to be your responsibility to use your best judgment to advise policymakers as to what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. So we can do the best science, the best engineering, the best technology, but at the end of the day, really public policies are going to be equally influential. You have a responsibility to be active and participate in that discussion. We talk about scalability. The good news in the US and other places is that renewables are growing with time. You know, that's good news. The bad news is that we are 2 orders of magnitude behind the curve, okay? Even if solar gets doubled, we still have to increase it by 500 to really catch up with the fossil fuels. So the only technology today that can scale up to be comparable with fossil fuels is nuclear energy. So we need to rely on nuclear energy if we want to displace fossil fuels. Energy efficiency is a great opportunity. I show you the energy flow diagrams. 60% of the energy is wasted. So instead of building new power plants, perhaps we could do a better job improving energy efficiency, which means that we don't have to build new power plants to generate the energy and the electricity that we need. And then lastly, the water energy nexus. You know, these things are connected. We are just seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face. I predict, and I hope it doesn't come true, but I predict that you're going to see countries going to war, fighting for water. Okay, and it's just a matter of time. There's really no way around, and we cannot ignore this. This is actually pretty serious business. So with that, I want to stop. I want to open the floor for questions, discussions, feedback.
Anyone, please?
Come on, guys.
No ideas from you people?
Was anybody surprised by this discussion? Did something caught your attention that you say, man, I wasn't aware of that? No?
I think that it's really smart, the fact that you put in like thermoelectric devices in cars, houses, in everywhere where there is a losses on heat. That nowadays we are losing heat everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a huge opportunity to recover some energy. All that.
No, I agree with you. And on Thursday, I want to show you some more information on thermoelectric. There is a lot of work on thermoelectrics. The potential is great. And as you will see on Thursday, this is one of those situations where we scientists are fighting against nature. And you're going to see why this is really a major challenge. And it means developing materials that do not exist in nature. I mean, we are really coming up with new materials that only exist in an equation form today that will help us develop the properties that we need for a good thermoelectric. Just to give you an idea of the type of problems that we are dealing with, a good thermoelectric has to be a thermal insulator, but has to be a good electrical conductor. Okay? And this is a challenge because if I ask you to plot thermal conductivity versus electrical conductivity, what would that plot look like? Thermal conductivity versus electrical conductivity for most materials. So if you're a thermal insulator, are you a good conductor? If you're a good conductor, are you thermal conductor? So if you take a survey of 1,000 materials, most materials are going to fall in this line. If you're a good electrical conductor, you're going to be a good thermal conductor. Okay? That's nature. Electrons can carry heat. So if you're a good electrical conductor, it's going to be a good thermal conductor. For thermoelectrics, we want a material that is a thermal insulator, okay? But it's also a good electrical conductor. So what we are really looking at are materials that are going to be here. So we are really fighting against nature, okay? It's really counterintuitive, and it's difficult to find. I mean, if you pick up aluminum is a great electrical conductor, but it's also a good thermal conductor. So aluminum is right here. You could have aluminum oxide, which is a thermal insulator, but it's also an electrical insulator. So what we are looking for are materials that are very good electrical conductors, but they are also thermal insulators. And a lot of those materials do not exist in nature. So the challenge for thermoelectrics is really coming up with new materials that do not exist, but that show these characteristics. So from a material science perspective, this is really the ultimate goal. And the nice thing about it is that we are actually making progress here. Now, once we solve this problem, then the next problem is cost. And then the next issue is availability of materials. Because a lot of times you can come up with great properties, but then you are using materials that are extremely rare, like platinum or palladium, and then we go back to the drawing board. So on Thursday, we're going to talk about thermoelectric materials. Okay? Great opportunity. Like you said, we're wasting a lot of heat. If we could come up with systems that would recover that heat and convert it into electricity, it would make tremendous progress. What else?
During the last weeks, I was reading about the thermoelectric process, and one key aspect that most of the papers mentioned said was that the scalability is also a key factor in order to develop the thermoelectric technology, and that nanotechnology was the driving force of the new materials for thermoelectric. Yeah. Is that true? Or?
Absolutely. That's a good point. And we're going to talk about this on Thursday, but let me show you just a little, give you a little glimpse of what's coming. So this is a plot of, this is the figure of merit, okay? And on Thursday we're going to talk about this figure of merit, but the figure of merit is called CT. So it's the something called the Seebeck coefficient, okay? And then you have the electrical conductivity, and then the thermal conductivity, okay? That's right, and then the temperature. So you have, if you go to a table of thermocouples, what you're going to read is a value in voltage for a temperature gradient, okay? That's what we call the thermal power. Electrical conductivity and thermal conductivity. So the greater this number, the better the thermoelectric become. So that plot shows the figure of merit as a function of time. So 1940, it's a 1.2, and then they develop these tellurium-based alloys with bismuth telluride and lead telluride. So they started getting up to 1. And then from the 1960s up to the end of the century, pretty much that was the top value, 1. We're going to talk about the space program, and you know, if you look at the, have you heard about Cassini? The Cassini probe is going through the solar system, getting these beautiful pictures from Saturn and the planet. It's powered with the radioisotope thermoelectric generator, like the one we have in Mars, and using these silicon germanium alloys. If you look at the Apollo program, in the Apollo program we left a lot of power supplies on the surface of the moon, using these various alloys, bismuth telluride and lead telluride. But you know, everything stayed constant for almost 40 years. And then we started making investments in nanotechnology. And look what happened. Now we have figures of merit of 2, okay? And there are some compounds like these scatolodides. These were developed by Jet Propulsion Lab. These were developed by Northwestern University and Michigan State University. And then, you know, there is really no limit on how high we could go. If we can get to a value of 3, that's a game changer. In fact, if we can develop a thermoelectric that gets to a value of 3 and that is abundant, we could replace the internal combustion engine, okay? So in an internal combustion engine, you have the pistons, okay? And then the pistons convert the energy of the fuel into mechanical energy. If we get a value of 3 for the figure of merit, your engine could be a big heater. You could have, let's say, you inject fuel, you just heat it. And you really get very hot, you know, 1,000 degrees C. And then you put your thermoelectrics around the hot source, and then you convert this into electricity. Okay? So your engine, instead of having the pistons that are going to be wearing out and having friction, all you have to do is generate a lot of heat with methane or gasoline or diesel, and then you convert all the heat into electricity. That electricity can be used to move an electric motor. So if you remember that chart that I showed you from General Motors, that show hybrids, electric, hydrogen cars, remember? It's all about electrification of transportation. If you have a fuel cell, it's electrons that are going to be moving an electric car. If you have a battery, it's going to be electrons that move an electric motor. Here you could have heat through a thermoelectric that converts into electricity. And that electricity can be used to move an electric motor for transportation. So if you can get to a value of 3 for the figure of merit, then you could start seeing thermoelectrics in automobiles, not just to recover waste heat, but actually to produce electricity to move the cars. I mean, this thing is just incredible. So you're absolutely right. The advent of nanotechnology has really enabled this to happen. And on Thursday, we're going to talk about this, you know, why nanotechnology? And there are some reasons for why this happened.
Why coupling nano-solar photovoltaic cell and thermoelectric device?
Yeah. So in the case of PV and thermal, so you have a photon, okay, from electromagnetic radiation, and this photon can have one wavelength. But if you have solar light, you have a whole spectrum of it. So the idea of these cells is that you will have this so-called multi-junction. You will have these multi-junction cells where, depending on the characteristics, you know, this will absorb certain color and convert into electricity. This one is another color, this one another color. And then these ones, which will be a thermoelectric, will absorb actually all the red part of the spectrum, which is all heat, the infrared, and then convert it into electricity. So by doing that, you convert the visible part to electricity, and then you have the infrared, which is the heat, into electricity.
But the efficiency of the thermoelectric devices is around 4 or 5?
The best ones can probably get up to 7, 8, 9, 10. If you can get up here to 3, then the efficiency is getting close to 20%.
And that's enough to eliminate the combustion engines?
Oh yeah, if you get to 20%, I mean, you're talking serious business here. I mean, really serious business. Because you have no emissions. Well, depends on the source, the source heat, the source of the heat. But yeah, 20% efficiency in thermoelectrics could be major break. Major break. And I got some charts that we'll talk about on Thursday to see where we are. Okay. More questions? Were you guys surprised by any information? Something that got your attention? Teresa?
Yeah, I was really surprised about the amount of energy that is produced but it's not used. I was really surprised about that because I don't really understand what happened, why we don't use that energy, or why we don't improve the mechanism to make that energy useful.
Yeah, no, you know, when I show people these energy flow diagrams, I want that to be one of the takeaway points, that we waste 60% of the energy. I mean, just think about it, 60% of the energy is just wasted. So, obviously thermodynamics tells us how we can get efficient. So we have the Carnot cycle, for example. You say, if you take the ratio of temperature of the hot reservoir and the low reservoir, that gives you how much efficiency you have. So by burning fuels at a higher temperature, you can actually improve efficiency. Now, if you want to go to higher temperature, it means that you need special material. So if you think about gas turbines, to go from a metal to a ceramic, that will give you the temperature that you need to go from 35% to 50% efficiency. The problem with ceramics is that the cost is so high that it will make some of these technologies unaffordable. So that's where cost really comes into the picture. People are more willing to waste and give up that than to spend more money in trying to recover some of that waste. So it's an issue of economics when you work with engineers. And, you know, as engineers, I mean, you know, we lack about nanotechnology, quantum mechanics, engineering, and this and that, and at the end of the day, it's economics. And here is where public policies are so important, because if we have the right cost and the right price on everything, whether it's emissions, sources, things will equilibrate, and then efficiency will make much more sense. You could actually write laws, and you know, talking about, I showed you the West Virginia, the tree hoggers and the coal. Okay? So here comes President Obama in 2009, and he says, okay, I'm gonna set a mandate that every light source has to have certain efficiency. And the only technology that could do the job were either compact fluorescent or LEDs. And incandescent lamps couldn't get there. So as a result of the law, no longer companies should be able to sell incandescent lamps. Well, somebody got upset and said, you are restricting my freedom. My freedom is to use any type of lighting that I want in my home. I want to use incandescent lamps. And this is crazy. People went to Walmart and they purchased every incandescent lamp that was available. And when you start thinking about it, it says, you know, these people are buying incandescent lamps. They want to use incandescent lamps, which are not very efficient. They're going to be wasting a lot of energy. And they do it just to make a point that their freedom has been affected because the government is telling you that you have to meet certain standards. And this is really part of the debate. You know, there's a reality that we were talking about China and the US, freedoms and all that, which is fine. But at one point, you know, common sense has to come into the picture. And unfortunately, even in the US, you know, we don't have a lot of common sense. In that debate with light bulbs, it was, this is amazing. There was a congresswoman from Minnesota. His name is Michelle Bachmann. And she ran for president 4 years ago. And there is an organization in the US called the Tea Party. And these are ultra-right, you know, they hate the government, they hate Obama. And the Secretary of Energy was testifying in the House. And she went into a tirade, it's on YouTube, telling the Secretary of Energy how he dared to tell her what type of light bulbs she was going to use. She wanted to use incandescent light bulbs and blah, 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 blah. And you say, you know, these people are pretty stupid, you know, because they're going to be wasting their dollars, they're, you know, paying more for energy than what we should do. And granted, you know, the LED lamps are a little more expensive, but in the great scheme of things, you know, we get paid upfront for cleaner technologies, or we pay as a country for emergency disasters when we have to relocate people dwelling on the coast. So, but you're right. So that, you know, economics really comes into the picture, and this is why we really haven't done better. If we had as a government the authority or the freedom to tell people what to do, and you know, slowly when you look at the refrigerators, if you buy in the US an appliance, there's a sticker called energy saving. And those are a little more expensive, but you know, they actually meet certain standards of higher efficiency. And people, you know, they are intelligent, they buy those because you know, it's going to cost you over the life of the refrigerator much less than what you would pay up front to buy it. It's going to be more efficient. Okay?
Thank you very much, Edgar.